All right, hello. We're going to be practicing watercolor texture techniques. For some of you, this will be review, and for some of you, this will be fresh. So what you're going to need is your sketchbook that we stitched together for this class. You can see here's my sketchbook here, and I'm going to open it up to my first set of fresh pages. I'm going to need a roll of tape or tape to share, and on the cabinet where your cubbies are, where you're keeping your work, under the bulletin board where it says painting 2 and 3, there are blue boxes. They're like blue Rubbermaid totes about the size of a shoebox. There's one of those for every table in the room. So you'll need somebody at your table to go get we call them the texture bins. Inside that texture bin, there are some supplies that you guys are gonna have to share as we go through this process. Inside that texture bin, you do have a little jar with rubbing alcohol in it. You do wanna make sure that that jar stays shut, and you do want to make sure that that jar stays like upright, even at the end of class today when you go to put your texture bin away. Alcohol evaporates really quickly, and it does make the bins kind of smelly if they dump. So it's just something to be cautious of. But we're going to go through a bunch of watercolor textures. So first step is to go ahead and tape your sketchbook. So I'm just gonna start here in the middle, and I need 12 rectangles or spaces. If I wanna get fancy, I can get fancy. I need 12, so if I go in columns, divide each page in half, and then divide them in thirds, I can make 12 sections happen fairly quickly without any fuss. Like, I certainly could make some other pattern in my sketchbook and that would be completely fine, but I do need 12 sections. So that's your first step. Oops, kind of short over here. From there, you're going to need paper towel for sure, and your watercolor. I'm going to go ahead. I am a kind of a dork for having a white border around everything. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tape my sides as well. You do not have to do this. I like the way that little white border looks, so this is what I'm gonna do. In each of these sections, we're gonna do some practice and experimentation. I'm gonna walk you through the main ways to create texture in watercolor. And like I said, for some of you, this is gonna be review. If you had painting one in person, for anyone who had painting one or even painting two, either hybrid or online last year, we did not do this. So it should be new-ish information for all of you. So here I go. I have my 12 sections and I'm ready to paint. I can paint using any colors today. The colors that I choose to use are 100% up to me. I get to decide. So just gonna go ahead and have my paint palette like at the ready. And we're gonna go through a couple of these. Like, we practiced a couple of these already with our flat wash and our graded wash, the 2-color wash. But some of these are gonna be fresh. So we're gonna start right here. And we're going to start with like the most basic way to give your watercolor some texture, and that is to paint with more than one color. So I'm gonna do what we call a wet into wet wash. So I used just some of my water, and I'm just gonna use random color from my palette. So I'm gonna just bump some color into this wash, and I'm just gonna let it do its thing. This is a unique property of watercolor. It's literally the only kind of paint that does this, and just makes its own thing happen in the puddle. So I want you to go ahead, and if your color isn't spreading, if nothing seems like it's happening when you do this, it's just a sign that you don't have enough water. So you can see here, I can put a straight stripe down the side, and this color isn't going anywhere, just because the paper over here is dry. So adding a little bit of water should fix the problem. If you have too much water, like I'm starting to have too much water over here, what will happen is all the colors will mix together and you will have no definition between the colors that you've picked to put in here. So you do want to think about, if you see that happening, like I can see that I'm just having a big puddle moment over here, you have a couple of choices. You can do it like I'm doing and get some of that water off of there with a little bit of paper towel. Because like I said, if I end up with too much water, it's just going to blend all together. Or you can use your paintbrush. So I'm just going to splash a little bit of juicy purple back on top of here, just to kind of give me some definition. So there's no real right or wrong way to do a wet into wet mix. It's just to let the paint kind of mix on its own in the puddle. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do another wet into wet mix. I'm going to use some different colors this time. Not going to use the same colors. I'm just going to kind of experiment here a little bit. The first time I put clean water down. This time I think I'm going to paint the whole space yellow. So there is more than one way to do wet into wet color mixing. So you can experiment with these different methods. So the trick is to just have my color be damp enough by the time I get to like the next color that I'm gonna add. So you can see that is definitely the case. My color's blooming open here. Add a third color. So that was a different way to apply the paint, is to put a quick wash down over the space and then add color in. I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit more yellow, just because I feel like I need a little more yellow over here on this side. The green kind of took over. And now you can see again that I have this big puddly moment here in the middle where the color just sort of starts to not look as interesting. And I cleaned my paintbrush out and I squeezed it dry. And I'm just gonna lift some of that off. So a clean, like squeeze dry paintbrush will always pull. So you can see I can pull like some clouds out of here. Clean dry paintbrush takes paint off your paper. So it's kind of a cool effect. We're practicing these so that we can paint our portrait, and knowing that we're gonna color our paper first and then paint a portrait over the top, it can be a really good idea to kind of have a way to sort of lighten the color. I don't want color to be too dark and intense before I start, because then it's hard for me to paint a portrait over the top. So I'm gonna kind of do some paper towel texture up here with kind of that same thought in mind. So you can see that because I still had a lot of paint on here, it's not staying like lifted off. So if I really want a white spot, I have to go back at it again. But like I said, wet into wet color mix. I am gonna do wet into wet color mix again. This time, I do need to just have a little bit of salt ready. And I'm gonna start with a darker color. So like I said before, I'm sort of experimenting with color. I kind of like the way it worked with the color laid down first. You decide what's best for you. A little bit of water over here. And now I'm gonna just add a few other colors in. So I'm just taking my paint. Oh, that's not much different than that color. There we go. Now I'm going to add salt to this while it's wet. And I'm going to add salt kind of mostly where I'm putting this red. And then the salt just has to get scraped off. So I'm gonna do a sprinkle. Like I don't want to put a full coat of salt. The salt makes the best effects if it's used kind of sparingly. So just like salt on your food, right? It's better for you if you don't use a lot of it. So I don't want a whole coating. I just want a sprinkle. And what happens is you can see it's happening already. The salt is a desiccant and it like soaks up the pigment and the water. So it like kind of gathers it up. The full salt effect is not visible until it's dry. So this will be a reveal for tomorrow, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and just let that one sit there and do its thing, okay? Next, you can use a color crayon. So color crayon blocks off or seals off part of your paper. You can use a color. You can just use white. In your bin, you just have white. There is some greater success with oil pastels. So if this is something that you want to pursue in your project, probably have used oil pastels instead of the color crayon. But what I'm going to do is kind of lay down a drawing or a pattern first with the crayon, and then I'm going to put darker paint over the top of it. I do have to color fairly hard because I'm going to need a good coat of wax on the surface of my paper before putting any color down. This is also a really great way if you know you have a spot in your painting that you need to stay white. This will do it, right? I can keep an area white. So I've just laid down a bit of a pattern here. It's kind of funky to see because it's white on white, but if I tip my head to the side, I can see the wax on the surface of the sheet. So I'm just going over some of my lines a little bit just to make sure they're good and dark before adding my paint. So I'm just gonna go ahead, pick a random color. I can even do wet into wet again over the top, but you'll see right away that my my waxy lines show up on the surface of the sheet as a pattern. It blocks out the paint from hitting the surface. If you use this in the background of your project, we do just have to run it through the heat press after to melt the wax off so that you can then paint over the top of it. So if you have, this is good to think about using, like if you have, maybe there's a pattern, a simple pattern that's important to your culture. Maybe you want to write in the background with the crayon and have those letters be lighter or a separate color, and then you paint over the top of that. So there's all sorts of uses for using that color crayon to kind of block out sections, or thinking about how you can use it in your background with a kind of specific intention. I can make a pattern, I can draw some leaves in the background, I can do all kinds of things in sections with a crayon and paint over the top of it. And then, like I said, once this is dry, I can go ahead and heat that waxy bit off of there and then be able to paint over the top, so that pattern will kind of glow through whatever I paint over the top of it. So sort of an interesting thing that you can go ahead and experiment with or think about using in your portrait project. So we did 3 wet into wet. One over here with salt. I'm gonna do, you'll see, we use a lot of wet into wet because I want more than one color. We're gonna be doing this project with a color scheme. And so I wanna always be using more than one color while I'm practicing these techniques, because we're gonna use more than one color in our project. So I'm gonna go ahead, do another wet into wet wash, kind of just exploring with some color combinations right now. Also just trying to kind of clean my palette off because I got a little strange color over here. And what I want to have ready this time is my alcohol. So I know you have just one alcohol bin at your table and you kind of have to share. So you can kind of pass it around, or you can scoot closer and sit with each other while you do this, or one of you can wait and do the next technique before doing the alcohol. I do not want to put my paintbrush on the alcohol because alcohol does a weird thing. So I'm going to just dip the handle of my paintbrush in. So I'm dipping the handle in and I'm going to splash. And just like the salt, the alcohol opens up like these strange spaces in my paint. It's like the surface of the moon a little bit. Like the surface of the moon. So that's rubbing alcohol. It does push paint away from the surface of the color, right? It kind of makes these potholes in your color. We are, you should have some stamping material in your bin. So we're going to talk about using watercolor as a stamp. I'm going to paint, but we have to paint a background first. I'm not going to do stamping on a naked sheet of paper. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and paint a wash. I can have it be a flat wash. I can have it be a graded wash. I could do a little wet into wet, but we want this to dry so we can talk about utilizing stamps and things that stamp into watercolor. So you can see I've kind of got my mushy couple of colors of green, but I'm keeping it a little light because I'm going to add some texture over the top of this. And this guy just has to dry. So I'm going to let that one settle, and we're going to move down my sheet to my next set of 3. And I'm going to show you a couple more. And there are a couple that you have to like let dry overnight. So we're going to talk about those. In your container, in your bin, you should have some little rectangles of wax paper. So I have a little piece of wax paper here. I am again going to do wet into wet color mixing, using that more than one color idea so that my color isn't just all one color, but it's more than one color. Just kind of playing around with what some of the colors look like together, honestly, because some colors react better with each other. Some colors just make better color blends. I hate that color blue. Ew. What am I thinking? And some colors, like, I just don't like that color blue, so I try not to use it. Everybody has a different reaction to different colors, right? So I'm going to just kind of thinking about stripes a little bit here, kind of not really, just kind of mushing the color wet into wet, right? Letting it do its thing. And I'm going to take my wax paper and I'm just going to set it right on top. And later, when that dries, that will leave a texture in the paint, okay? So that guy's just gonna set there. Next, you should also have some pieces of plastic wrap. If in your bin, you don't have enough pieces of plastic wrap or wax paper, on the top of your cabinet, there is actually a box of both. Right? There's a box of wax paper and a box of plastic wrap. So if you need to grab more, there is definitely more of it there. So I have my plastic wrap ready to go. I am going to do the same thing. I'm going to do a wet into wet color mix again. And I'm going to do it, where am I going to do it? I'm going to do it here. This is another one. It has to dry. They don't work out. It's not an instant. A lot of these are not instant gratification, right? Going to have to let them dry before I see what they look like. Again, wet into wet color mixing so that I'm not just using one color. I am experimenting with multiple colors. You'll also notice the reason we also experiment with multiple colors all the time is some of these techniques work better with some of the pigments. So not every color will work for all of these. And it's just a process of knowing what colors, because you experimented, what colors do the alcohol best, what colors do the salt best. And that only comes with experiments like this. So I'm going to take, it's a lot like the wax paper. I'm going to take this and I'm going to kind of wad it up. I want texture. If I think about even like paper towel lift off, right? I want texture. And what I'm going to do is just put this down in the surface of that paint. It has to be wet when I do it. Otherwise it doesn't work. And it shouldn't be smooth. Well, I guess you can try it smooth and see what happens. It'll just be a little bit different texture moment. And I'm just going to stick it in, stick it down, and let it dry. So I won't see what that looks like until tomorrow. Just like the salt, just like the wax paper, okay? My mix over here is not quite dry yet, so we're gonna do one more. So, and then you're gonna experiment, okay? So you're gonna have 3 extra squares when I'm done showing you all these techniques, and you are going to, I want you to combine them. I want you to like see, what does salt and alcohol look like? What does the crayon with paper towel lift off look like? What happens if I use different colors with the salt or different colors with the alcohol? So you're going to have spaces available to make those explorations happen. What if I put salt down and then plastic? What if I put alcohol down and plastic? What if I put, you get the idea. I want you to combine some of these now in kind of an exploratory fashion. So I am almost done showing you the techniques. Your job for filling these last 4 spaces is to redo some of these, one for practice, so that you can feel more successful if some of them haven't turned out, and 2, to kind of explore, right? Maybe I really like the way the alcohol looks, but I'm curious what the alcohol also looks like with plastic wrap. And you'll know some of that tomorrow when you come in a little bit more too. And we end up with one other day of experiments with these textures because we want to make sure we have a good grip on those textures before making our project. So this is dry enough now, so I'm going to show you the stamping. So in your bin, you have some bubble wrap. Please don't pop the bubbles. It doesn't work if you pop all the bubbles. We need the bubbles to make the effect work. You also will have some small square like pattern stamps. You might have some bottle caps, some different plastic things, right? Those are all for creating stamps. So I have a big rubber band here, I have bubble wrap, and I have a little rabbit stamp. So I'm going to see how all of these work. I think I'm going to try the rubber band first, and I'm going to paint the surface a color. So I'm coming over here to my palette, and I'm going to get some green paint. So it kind of goes with the background that I've put on here. And I'm just going to paint the top edge of this green. So this process is the same if you're using one of the little texture stamps. Sometimes if you have a bottle cap, you can dip it into paint on your palette. Oops, I just changed color. And I'm just going to put a whole coat on the surface of this rubber band. And I'm going to flip it over onto the surface of my watercolor paper. And I'm just going to press it down and see what happens. And I do get, oh, that's actually really cool. I'm going to see if I can get another stamp if there's still extra paint. There is extra paint. That's kind of fun. So it made like this loop-de-loop. That's kind of exciting. I'm now going to do the same thing with some bubble wrap. So I'm cleaning my paintbrush off. I'm going to get some yellow paint, and I'm going to just paint the surface of the bubbles. Paint the surface of the bubbles. And I'm going to stick the bubbles very carefully to the surface of my watercolor paper, and I get dots. Right? If my bubbles wrap is all popped and I don't have holes still to hold up, then it gets a little mushier, okay? And you can see because I stamped wet on top of wet, those colors are kind of mixing together. And I can do the same thing with my little texture stamp. I can paint the surface of this. So you have, like I said, you have some little pattern stamps, and I can paint this with the watercolor. And I do need less water, more paint, and I can just stamp this little guy down. So it's kind of fun. Like if you ever colored on a stamp with markers and did this as a kid, it's the same kind of thing. So there's my little rabbit on there. I have some leaves and fish and butterfly. I think I have some butterflies. I have stamps, big rubbery, textury ones, and more of those texture sheets. So it can be kind of a fun detail to add later on to your portrait. So go ahead and explore. You're gonna fill all of these. You should not have empty squares. And I want you to kind of combine techniques or retry one of these techniques that you feel like you weren't successful at, so that you can come back tomorrow ready for our next steps.